Oh, thank you so much to Dr. Saxe for what was a very thoughtful and powerful presentation. At this time, I'd like to invite all of our guests to come and take the panel. We'll have Councillor Wilson, Councillor Farr, Councillor Nann, Councillor Danko, our City Manager, Janette Smith, and Dr. Diane Saxe, as well as Ian Borsuk from Environment Hamilton. Everybody comfortable? Okay, so I'm just going to start with some panel questions. We'll start with one person and then we'll pass that mic around there. So we're first going to start out by thinking about what stood out in terms of best practices in other municipalities. So what questions might you have for your city staff tomorrow based on the content of tonight's presentation? And we're going to ask City Manager Smith if you could start us off.
I'm always first. So for me, because I've been getting to know the Hamilton specific statistics, I really want to tackle the transportation issue. Because for a couple reasons. You saw from the presentation in terms of after we take industry away, the biggest cause in the city of emissions, 55% is transportation. And then if you look at the city, in our operations and our footprint, 44% is transportation. So from a couple of different ways. One is in terms of our city operations about how we start moving our fleet over to electric vehicles. And for some types of vehicles we need for our services, the types of vehicles are there already. I'm interested in the issue around the batteries with the bus, the electric buses. And so I'd want to look into that further in the feasibility. I think also we know we have a lot of big vehicles. Think fire trucks and some of our public works vehicles. But right now there is no option except for diesel. And so how do we encourage manufacturers to do, look for new technology to bring electric and other low emission to some of those bigger vehicles, because I think everyone still wants fire trucks. And the city alone probably isn't going to convince them, but what can we do to maybe work with neighboring municipalities to do that? And then when it comes to the external to the city operations, so right now, 67% of trips in the city of Hamilton are done in a single vehicle car. And for me, it's not just about the emissions. My background's public health. And I was one of those people that sat in a car for 2 hours a day. My mental health was not good of doing that. So, and your physical health is not good. And your ability to give back to your community and spend time with your family when you're sitting in the car for that long. So we have to look at how we get people out of their car. And I'm really curious to see, I saw Seville, but also in North American examples of where they've really been able to get people out of their car, and what are those policy levers and kind of the carrot and the stick to bring that multimodal split to a different ratio between single vehicle cars and using active transportation and transit.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that a little bit from a council perspective. I think our role as well is to encourage our staff to come up with these innovative solutions, come up with these ideas and bring them to council, and to have that discussion. And as a council and as elected officials, our role is to make sure that when there are solutions that are possible, that we have that discussion in a public forum and have involved the community and all of you to be involved with that discussion. Because at the end of the day, our staff, like Dr. Saxe said, we want to thank them for doing that hard work. And a lot of times that hard work kind of goes on behind the scenes and isn't as celebrated or recognized as well as it can be. So from a council perspective, I think, like I said, our job is to make sure that staff know that they're supported in these endeavors.
Thank you. So I know that there's 2 mics floating about there. Is there anyone else who wanted to chime in on this? What takeaways do we have of best practices in other municipalities, or anything we might be wanting to share or talk to city staff about tomorrow?
Thank you. It wasn't highlighted, but I'm always interested in public engagement. And I don't think anything is going to be possible if there isn't a perceived political urgency to act. And so I know in the city of Chicago, they have been at this since at least 2006. And they have a very intricate and sophisticated way in which to involve the city as a whole, but also breaking down the pieces of the city in accordance to that speak to the equity component that Dr. Saxe raised. And I think we really, when we're coming out with our climate action plans, we're going to have to give as much attention to how are we going to involve our residents so that they can feel that hope and also that responsibility. And it can't be the usual cast of characters. And it has to be a very deliberate process of enabling people to get their hands dirty and speaking to their self-interest. So whether it's farmers, whether it's people in the Northeast End or people in Kirkendall, we're going to have to get people engaged if we're going to move the yardsticks. And that's what I'm really interested in.
And I'll say real quick, since tomorrow, Councillor Wilson, Danko, and myself have planning committee, and directly to your question, I see our general manager of planning is here, Jason Thorne, who lives sustainably, lives downtown, doesn't drive, and certainly appreciates the topic. And I just want to also say this is a great start, and I know it's just a start. So engagement so far, which is a really great point. I'm not surprised to see a full house here tonight. But I would suggest, since it's planning committee, maybe we take Jason Thorne aside tomorrow and talk about some of the things that we've heard here today. We do have incentives in the city of Hamilton. We're trying to accommodate some sustainable growth. Maybe it's time to ramp that up. The other thing I just want to say personally from the takeaway, I get frustrated, and I have no slight to one of the greatest hours of public speaking I've seen in Hamilton, but there's a number of people in this room that knows I'm full of Hamilton pride, and I shudder when I hear you got a highway running through your core, and I shouldn't be surprised because it's so blatantly obvious. And it hurts me though, as the councillor who really early last term couldn't even get a seconder to move a motion to study a two-way conversion of Main Street at an LRT meeting.
Second it.
That was then. This is now. But I do appreciate that. 24 kilometers of bike lanes in the downtown, but now it's time to go for 24 more. It's the smallest ward, but it's clearly a place where people love to ride, and obviously some of the people in the room know there's an emphasis now on protecting the ones we have, and we're showing evidence of that. But I think there's a greater mentality that there's never enough. And tomorrow, we'll take Jay aside, and then if I have time, I'm going to pop into the city manager's office because I really love that contest idea between departments.
I think that one thing that stood out for me is that we really do have to look at localized solutions. It's not always, even though I'm always a proponent that says, let's look at the best practices of what other municipalities have done. How can we borrow some of those solutions and ideas to deal with some of the historical and systemic issues that we're facing here in our city too, as there are so many things that are in common among our municipalities across North America. There's also the reality of looking at what is uniquely Hamilton. And to build off of Councillor Wilson's point, when we look at the Code Red data and look at our public health outcomes of what our residents are actually currently experiencing, I'd love to see an overlay of that public health reality with what you were presenting earlier in terms of the impact of transportation, the impact of industry, because we know when it comes to certain sections and certain neighborhoods of our city that some of our residents are faring further or worse than those in other geographic areas. So what does that mean for how we prioritize our solutions and where we prioritize them to be implemented first? So who are we taking care of? When are we taking care of them? And what is the correct intervention and outcome that we're hoping to measure over time? So if it's respiratory health outcomes for a population that's been subjected to industrial pollution for a long time, for generations, and compounded on top of that is transportation impacts, then that becomes really clear for us as decision makers around the table about where we need to localize our solutions.
All right, so that's, before we move on to the next question, is there anyone else who wanted to add anything on that point? Okay, well, don't worry, we're going to address similar topics. So I think that the next logical question then is what progressive tools can municipalities put in place to accommodate projects? Considering that we have a projected population growth, and we know that, how can we make sure that we're accommodating projects that address the climate emergency?
I'll kick that
Thanks,
one off. So I'm going to put on my engineering hat for a moment because I am a professional civil engineer. And one thing you have to know about engineers and planners as well is that we are very, very, very conservative when it comes to doing new things or doing things differently, which means that we end up doing what we've done before over and over and over. So I'm just going to touch on two things because the question is what can we do as a municipality? So I'm going to touch on the building code and then I'm going to also touch on land use planning. So from the building code, which is a provincial mandate, so we as a municipality can't set building standards, and unfortunately at the moment we have a provincial government that is taking things out of the building code that are as simple as a rough-in for EV chargers, which was hardly consequential in terms of the building code. But as a municipality, we have examples in our city of best practices for buildings. So at Mohawk College, they have a net zero building at the Ron Joyce Center. We have, our City Housing Hamilton is building passive house standard buildings in our city right now that are very extremely energy efficient and are the next generation of buildings to come. So the question of what we can do as a city is we can lead by example, when, as Dr. Saxe mentioned, when we are building things that we have control over. And we can also promote green industry. And now that we have these examples in our community for those next generation, very environmentally friendly and energy efficient buildings, we can point to those examples and start building that green industry around that. I was just at the Ticats game on Saturday night, and I noticed that the carbon industry is advertising at football games for their interest, whatever those may be. And I posted something about that on Twitter, and one of the questions was, well, enjoy your natural gas heated house this evening. And I thought to myself, yes, my house is of course natural gas heated, but I'm really looking forward to building and promoting that green industry in Hamilton that employs Hamilton residents, that partners with our anchor institutions, Mohawk College, McMaster, and Redeemer, to build that industry so that I can go out and get the labor and the expertise that I need to convert my house and other buildings to a better standard, whether that's net zero or passive house or whatever that may be. So as from a municipal perspective, that's where we can take that leadership role in promoting that industry, and that it's not some sort of pie in the sky thing. This is something that we can do right now at the municipal level. Next, on the land use planning initiative. Now, this is something that, of course, as a municipality, we do have some direct control over. Now, of course, the province also has a role in that by setting our objectives. But we are heading into our second major land use planning exercise, Grids 2, which is going to set how our city is projected to grow, well, I believe it's to 2048, is it, Jason? 2041. So this is an extremely critical exercise that's going to set how our city is going to grow. And of course, our land use planning, as Dr. Saxe said, is directly related to our vehicle emissions and our building emissions. I think if you talk to any planner, any engineer that's graduated in the last 20, 30 years, I think they know pretty much what the solutions to a lot of our land use planning problems are. I think the solutions are fairly obvious. The difficulty that we have, and speaking as an elected representative, as a councillor, is the political will to implement those solutions. So I think that's where all of you come into play here, because you have 4 councillors here tonight that are very interested in implementing these kinds of solutions. I think we have some specific ideas of where we would like to see our Grids 2 process go and what solutions we'd like to see on the table, but keep in mind that we each have 1 vote out of 16 on our council. And we need help from the residents. We need help from all of you. We need help from your friends and your friends' friends, that when these issues do come to council, that you stay involved in the process and hold our feet to the fire. Tell your elected officials what you want done, because we just went through a federal election where climate change, surprise to everybody, was one of the main issues that decided this election. And we need to bring that, that change in the culture and in the social narrative to City Hall to hold us accountable for the decisions that we make as a council.
Yeah. Yeah, and building off of that, I have to admit I'm a longtime environmentalist, but I'm also a really big hip hop fan, and I find at events like this, much like a rap concert, I have lines from my favorite artists that I really look forward to hearing. And I have to admit, I've heard Dr. Saxe say the line of, Ontario's tar sands are land use planning as urban sprawl. And, here in Hamilton, we are dedicating resources and time at looking at expanding the urban boundary into Alfreda, which we know is prime agriculture land, and this is something that the City of Hamilton is seriously contemplating right now. And I know, and I really appreciate your comments, Councillor Danko, but I think really if we're going to be looking at what the city can do and what we as Environment Hamilton called on the city, all of City Council to do, which wasn't just these 4 councillors, unanimously they approved the motion, was one of our key demands was freezing the urban boundary and making it a firm urban boundary. And I think, really I just can't, I just can't imagine in this term of council, saying to a younger generation or anything like that, that we literally made the problem permanently worse.
So, thank you, Ian, for those comments. So is there anyone else who wants to speak to what has just been raised there on what tools, what progressive tools can be used to address this very problem? We know there's projected growth, but we want to make sure that we're considering that growth and accommodating it alongside the climate emergency. So is there anyone else who wants to speak to that?
Well, I'll pass to someone else to address that. I just want to say the whole Grids 2 process, there's a lot of consultations coming up. Please make your concerns and your voice heard so that council knows. Don't be, the silent group. There's lots of consultation coming up, and, please speak up.
I'm just going to say again, hamilton.ca/grids2. Yep, hamilton.ca/grids2. Real quick, because I think JP said it all, and he's a rookie. Mohawk College, in your ward, winner of a national award for the net zero building you've just completed. Absolutely incredible. I'm very proud to see Tom and some of our friends from City Housing, and Councillor John Paul Danko mentioned the passive house we're building, first high-rise passive house, I believe, in North America, here in Ward 2. Also, Mohawk, I got to say, you're probably going to win some international awards. It really is a spectacular thing. I talked to your architect today, Drew Hauser, and we have to try to connect ourselves as politicians and staff with the Drew Hausers that are out there in the private sector winning these awards, national, probably international, for this one project, who are really talking the talk and walking the walk. This isn't their only net zero project. They're doing a library in Toronto right now. They, Drew couldn't have been more forceful. He was under the weather and a bit miserable, but he was still quite forceful on the point that we have to focus more on supporting net zero builds in the city. And to hear that from someone who we work with, if they happen to have an application with us, it's kind of inspiring, because there's more Drew Hausers out there, and they're pretty smart people who regularly meet with our planning staff, who have relationships with our planning staff. They can bypass the politicians and start talking about some certain policy changes we can make to make it more accommodating to do that kind of thing.
I don't think we're going to have any questions. We're going to stay on our program here. Perhaps at the end we'll see how that timing works out. So I feel like this is actually now becoming a little bit of a did you pay attention to Dr. Saxe's presentation. So the next question, what do we need to consider? Well, a key theme in the presentation was travel and transportation. And so what do we need to consider when investing in public transit, so that it becomes a natural and easy choice for majority of residents to be utilizing? So Councillor Nann, would you like to start on this?
Sure. I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing. Number one, we have a 10-year transit strategy that needs to be fully funded and we need to carry through. But while we're also looking at our 10-year strategy, the half-year or the 5-year mark, we need to be looking at how are we invested in reestablishing a system that allows for interconnection throughout the city. We have a lot of residents who don't feel like they have enough transit options in order to get from their home to work, let alone daycare, in between on the way to work. So they're choosing to use their vehicles because they need to transport their children, and there is no direct route that works from a time efficiency perspective. So I'm encouraged by the fact that HSR is engaged in a conversation with residents about what does a connected transit route look like for you? What do you need the future route system to look like? Until we're actually able to map out a robust system that connects our communities across the city, we're not going to actually end up encouraging people to get out of their vehicles and choose transit. I think that the other component in this is also our road design, and the question about, Councillor Farr's point earlier about two-waying Main or two-waying King. I think when we design our road system in a way to flow traffic through a green wave, as opposed to prioritizing multimodal transportation and investing in increasing bike lanes, increasing connectivity, we have no other option but to maintain the status quo. So I believe we need to invest. We need to redesign a robust and well-connected green transit system. And I thought it was fantastic, Dr. Saxe, for you to bring forward the idea about renting the batteries versus renting the batteries. And I'm encouraged by the fact that our city manager also noticed that. I have a follow-up note to follow up with HSR. Given that we are looking at an electric fleet, what are some revenue generation opportunities for us there as well? There's also a question here about how we're investing in our current workers in the HSR system as well. So we have a current project to create a new storage and maintenance facility in Ward 3, which will have solar panels on the roof, and so long as all the federal funding comes through, that will be an incredible building. But most importantly, how are we investing in our workers that are there right now to train and be prepared to maintain an electric fleet as well? And what is the aggressive pace at which we can replace our fleet, our existing fleet, inside of a 12-year life cycle to replace those with battery and electric operated buses? So those are a couple of the ideas that I have there. But specifically also, how are we going to invest in it is the biggest question. And I know that the city of Ottawa was an early adopter in green bonds, and they used their green bonds to attract investors to fund their entire light rail transit system. So the robust system that they're putting in place right now has been green bonded funded by investors who want out of fossil fuel investment and into green investment. So I think there's a question here for us as a municipality to think about what is the aggressive target we want investors to be attracted to. And are we in a position to move towards green bonding that or finding other kind of green revolving funds to provide the revenue for it?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's also important in the context of, the Green New Deal was tried, organizations were pushing for it to be a major election issue. And I think a key aspect of the Green New Deal that I think is really compelling to people in Hamilton is the idea of good, clean, green jobs. And when you think of someone who is doing a green job, I think of a bus driver. And something that's been frustrating for me as an advocate trying to get you guys to do things is, looking at the way we fund our transit system and looking at how we pay for our drivers and how 20 years ago, prior to amalgamation, the province of Ontario paid for 50% of all operations of every single municipal transit service, and we've lost that. And now we have other levels of government, with the federal government more than willing to pay for capital costs. But when it comes to actually being a green employer, this is something that the City of Hamilton can lead on, and I can't think of anything better than hiring more drivers to fill those buses once we can get those buses, and being a green employer.
On investments in transit, this comes down to a certain extent anyway, council priorities. And in Hamilton anyway, I've lived in Hamilton my whole life, and I don't think there's any question that there is a certain stigma in Hamilton about who uses transit, and that stigma to a certain extent influences decisions about how transit is funded. And there's no question that there's an equity issue in transit. And when we talk about funding transit, I think we need to also be cognizant of maybe changing the conversation of who transit users are. And I'm thinking specifically about our growing senior population who traditionally would not be users of transit, who would not perhaps support investments in transit, but are now finding themselves isolated in their homes and are the perfect candidates to become new transit users. So the conversation about investing in transit and reducing that dependence on single occupancy vehicles, it has to extend to that equity piece as well, that we want transit from a health perspective to help those seniors get out of their homes, to stay involved in their communities, and also attracting young workers who, I know if you ask my parents, do you think somebody would possibly want to live in a city and not own a car? They'd be like, no, of course not. Everybody has to have a car. But younger people really do want to live in a city where it is an option for them to take transit. And who uses transit comes through to the argument of how it's funded and how, as a city, we prioritize that investment.
It's interesting. I was reading an article, and I never remember the place where it was at. I'd have to go back and look at it, but it talked about a municipality who really did want to increase ridership, to get more people using transit for lots of different reasons. And they said that's a good thing. However, they said that sometimes in doing that, they don't pay attention to the current riders they have now and hear from them as well. So I think, we have to have that balancing, that we really think about the riders we have now and how we make it better for them, as well as, trying to entice more people to get out of their cars and into transit.
Jason, you're here from HSR now, so what's our campaign, our engagement campaign? How can people get involved? Hamilton.ca/re-envision the HSR. Great. For those who maybe didn't hear, Jason, tomorrow's the reveal of the bus that we'll be using for engagement throughout this campaign. Also, Dr. Saxe wants us to tell you what to do tomorrow. I'm going to tell you tonight. I really also was struck by the idea that we are going to be bringing more and more electric buses into our fleet. I just know it's going to be more and more popular. They do need, the first few need to happen on the most polluted routes. And I'm not being parochial, I know I'm going to end up getting them, but, and they'll be popular, but I think that's a great plan and it's very easy to achieve. So I'm assuming you would have, in your genius, already been planning to launch in that capacity.
One last email you're getting.
Anyone else on public transit before we move on?
Just quickly, Kingston was able to increase their transit ridership, they told me 75% in a couple of years, and the big thing they did was add express bus routes.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your thoughts on transportation. So the next question becomes, with so many competing priorities this budget cycle, some may say that these investments are too expensive. But speaking to this question, are there any revenue tools that are available that have been used elsewhere that might be able to help in this situation? And Councillor Wilson, would you like to start on this one?
Thank you. We have, just last week, we began budget deliberations, and we're looking at 3 possible options. And the question I asked when looking at the options was, what principle is guiding us in our budget deliberations this time around? And it is my hope that that the principle that will guide us next time around, formally, will be a carbon budget. I know I'm supposed to lead off a conversation about revenues, but for me, I'm actually more interested in pricing, because I think there's lots of good examples that tell us that our behavior is, we can change behavior by pricing. And my friends on council are tired of me talking about this, but you know, for 40 years we've been talking about the value, both from a public health perspective and an environmental perspective, of compact urban form. But in downtown Hamilton, we continue to depopulate, and we're building more and more units still on greenfield, if you look at our stats. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why is, if we know what's the right thing to do, why is the thing we don't want to happen happening? So what is usually a very boring exercise, I think, turned into a very interesting exercise, something called development charges. And this new council just sort of got in on the tail end of that development charges exercise. So development charges are, the notion or the principle is that growth should pay for growth. And that if you're going to build new, then the people who are going to live in that new have to pay for that new. And what was revealed in our last budget cycle was that, in fact, that principle is not at work. In that 30% of those things that are extended, whether it be wastewater treatment, roads, emergency services, the rest of us are paying 30% of that new. So if we go back to, if price does affect behavior, then maybe we're mispricing it. We were able to have a very good discussion about that. We did find out that we are limited this time around with our ability to provide variable development charges. But we are going to be moving forward, I hope, with a motion coming at the next Audit and Finance Committee, which will ask staff to examine the methodology that will enable us to do ultimately more variable development charges. And the way we have to do that is through the studies that go in to form the basis of our next development charges. So our transportation master plan, our fire protection plan, our water servicing plan. So staff, I hope, with the support of my colleagues, are going to be looking at, can we build a sound methodology that looks at the different cost and the price that comes with development. So surely we know that when a development occurs over there, and we have to extend a road over there, the primary users of that road over there are the people who are living over there. So certainly there is some cost causality there. So if we're able to inform our studies and have a sound methodology that can hold up, then we should be able to come forward with a pricing system that more accurately expresses and captures the cost. Because it's hard for me in Ward 1, where right off the top, residents in Ward 1 are paying 1.5% increase in tax just at a base. So wherever we land, 1.5 on top of that for Ward 1 because of our assessment. So it is a slight annoyance of mine that I am still paying for over there. If you want to live over there, you should pay for living over there. And everything that comes with living over there, and God bless you if that's your choice, but at least pay for the full cost of it, and I think that ultimately will have an effect on whether over there is built anymore over there. In terms of revenues, I'm also interested in looking, trying to unearth things we don't think of as revenues. We have some of the lowest parking rates in all of Canada. And that, in my opinion, is a hidden subsidy. We don't think of it as that. We think of it as our natural right to park wherever we want. And that's the cost of it, but it's not the cost of it. So that is a subsidy that we're given to one particular user. And so I'm interested in unearthing what, how our costs compare to others. Well, I kind of know. And I'm interested in having a discussion with my colleagues about trying to move us closer to true costs, because we know that true costs affect behavior. I'm also interested in re-engaging the debate about the impact on our stormwater systems. And if you've got acres and acres of non-permeable surface, then you should be paying a little bit different cost than I am when I have a small permeated driveway. And unfortunately, we couch too many of these discussions and we use the word tax. So you're going to hear a lot of discussion coming up in this budget cycle about a rain tax. But for me, it all gets back to the issue of equity. So I think nomenclature is really important, and if we can wrestle that away and talk about fairness and the real cost of things, then I think we might be more successful.
On the question of revenue, interesting, earlier, maybe a month ago or so, I had a motion that that staff investigate options for a municipal carbon tax. And I was thinking in the context of some of the pipelines that we have through our city that require approval processes from the city of Hamilton. And in my discussions with the city legal counsel and finance staff, I realized that the word tax means something entirely different to finance and legal than it did in my head. And so when we're talking about revenue sources and a carbon tax, there's all kinds of different opportunities available to us as a municipality, some of which Dr. Saxe pointed out in her presentation, and things like Councillor Wilson just talked about in parking. And just relate a really quick story about my sister who visited from Vancouver and was coming to visit me at City Hall and asked, where can I park? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Park anywhere. And she's like, no, where can I park? So it's going to cost a lot. I'm like, no, just park anywhere. She came, visited me, parked, I think it was downtown under Jackson Square, and got back to her car and then freaked out because it cost $3. She's showing her husband, look at it, it costs $3 to park in Hamilton. Can you believe that? So we have so many opportunities for different revenue sources to help finance what we know we need to do. We just have to make sure that we clearly articulate to staff what it is that we mean, and when we're looking for revenue sources, to not be afraid to turn over all the stones.
I just wanted to just chime in real quick and just say it's refreshing from my perspective to hear about reacting to behavior in a means of trying to influence that behavior. And I think in the city of Hamilton, there's been a very long-standing trend of trying to allow Hamiltonians to do whatever they feel like doing, be that widening the average spot size of parking spaces because people just kept buying bigger and bigger vehicles, be that allowing people to throw out whatever they want in any bag they want and however many times they want. And I think really, looking at what the city of Hamilton can do in terms of revenue and putting a price on behavior that has a negative impact on the rest of the community is really important. And I think we as Hamiltonians should be really happy that we have city councilors actually acknowledging this out loud.
And Ian, so we were the cheapest place to park in all of Canada, save for North Bay 2 years ago. And Collins and I moved a motion to up it from $1 to $1.50, and we landed just above North Bay. So we're second cheapest in Ontario. And Kevin Warner's sitting over there from the newspaper, and he's about to tweet this, but Collins and I are already working to get us above Sudbury. So there'll be another increase this year. Thank you to my cousin up above there. So the other thing we continue to do, and now I'm advocating and reaching out to the private folks because it's just not happening fast enough for me. But it took 3 motions. It started 7 years ago through 2 terms of council. But we had 17 surface asphalt parking lots in the heart of downtown Hamilton. And those motions led to selling them all. And council, thank God, supported me all the way through. And they are up for surplus. All the staff comments on all the 17 lots have been made, and 2 have been sold. 2 look like they'll be sold soon. Some of them are large, some of them are small. The operating costs will be gone. The private sector will build something better, higher use, and hopefully accommodate a lot of things like some affordability with our new downtown secondary plan. That sort of stuff is built in. So we did recognize this, and probably from a conversation I had with Linda at Environment Hamilton's offices many, many years ago, it's frustrating that it takes so long. And some things we could do more efficiently and we could do faster. And I'm not surprised to be at yet another meeting in downtown Hamilton and parking comes up. It always does. It is the most prevalent issue. And very rarely from you folks do I hear it costs too much. My colleagues here, from those who commute to the center of the city because it is the center of business and commercial and retail and all of that stuff, that it costs too much. But it's really easy to say, we're only just above Sudbury. You're still getting off pretty cheap. I totally agree and have worked towards pay more for parking in the downtown than you do for getting on a bus. I totally believe in that. So we're there in a lot of places. And when we do it, the private sector jacks up their prices too. And I did read part of the book. There's no such thing as free parking.
If the one thing I wanted to add, because council members make the policy decisions, right? Council makes the policy decisions. We as staff make recommendations and bring information forward. And, you know, I think it's also our responsibility to, you know, also try to quantify the cost of not doing things. And that's not always easy, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I go back to when the first big move report came out from Metrolinx, right? And it was that big number, and everyone was freaking out how much it was going to cost. And the medical officers of health got together, and they quantified how much we were going to spend on diabetes and everything that comes with diabetes, kidney transplants, et cetera, et cetera. And so how much we were going to spend in the healthcare system if we didn't build transit, because people who take transit naturally are walking more and are healthier. The evidence shows that. And so sometimes for some people, quantifying things that, you know, it'll reduce emissions because they're really driven by, you know, the climate change issue. Others people are driven by the other benefits around mental health or the impacts to mental health if we don't do it, or the healthcare system, et cetera. So I think we have to look at these things from a number of different lenses and try to quantify, if we don't do this, what could it potentially cost as well.
Okay, that's a good place to stop. So thank you so much, everyone, for your answers to the questions. At this time, we have about 20 minutes where we're going to open it up, and I should say right off the bat that I think this is a surprise to some of our panelists, that we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. So keeping in mind that the time is short, we're looking for powerful, meaningful questions that are not directed at any one individual, but are just kind of a general question to the panel, and can help us to move this conversation forward. And a meaningful, short questions, that's right. So we're asking questions more than we're sharing information, and we're making sure that we're directing those questions to the whole panel.
Thank you. Just had a quick question about using electric vehicles. I've heard a lot of people arguing that the cost of lithium extraction and then the recycling or disposal of lithium batteries is just as detrimental as sticking with the carbon system that we have already. I'm sure that's not true, but I don't know how to argue it. So I was wondering if you could help me out.
I can start that one off. So I think the question of battery technology is one of the barriers to real climate action, in that we're still struggling with how to store electricity in a way that's useful. And the lithium-ion batteries are the current technology, but I know from visiting McMaster Innovation Factory and MIP that there are quite a few different and new technologies for batteries that don't involve lithium at all. And I think it's quite clear in the industry that that is a concern. But as we move forward and as these technologies become more mainstream, all kinds of research and innovation, and we're very fortunate here in Hamilton to have one of the top research universities in the world that is working on this. So not to pass this off and say that there's a technological solution, but I think in terms of technologies and batteries and all kinds of the technologies that we are going to need to reach our climate goals, there's some very smart people working on better solutions.
Hi. We, as commissioner, I didn't specifically review batteries, but we reviewed whether the embodied carbon in diesel vehicles versus, basically, should you scrap old vehicles and build new ones? And the answer was absolutely we should scrap old ones and build new ones, because yes, there is a lot of metal in a vehicle. There's a lot of energy that goes into building a vehicle, but when it comes to vehicles, the enormous majority of the impact comes from driving it around, not from building it. Building it is tiny compared to the overall impact. So anything you can do to get rid of the diesel that is used in the operation of the vehicle makes it worthwhile. Yes, we still should mine more carefully. Yes, we need to find ways to continuously reuse lithium. Lithium is an element. It's still lithium when you're done with it, and so there's no reason why it should have to be thrown away. But when it comes to vehicles, because the fuel used in driving around is the overall impact, anything that reduces that is worthwhile.
Okay.
Hi. So looking at Ontario's success story with phasing out coal between 2003 and 2014 using nuclear energy and hydro, what are the municipality of Hamilton doing to accommodate clean energy projects, namely small modular reactors?
Anybody want to?
So unfortunately, we don't have a nuclear reactor at the City of Hamilton, although McMaster University does. In our profile as a municipality, we do have green energy generation projects. So we have Hamilton Renewable Power, Inc., which has 2 cogeneration facilities. There's one at the Woodward Treatment Plant, which takes methane gas from processing sewage and uses that to generate electricity. And there's another one at the Glanbrook landfill, which is taking methane and other gases from the landfill and using that to generate electricity as well. And on top of that, in downtown Hamilton, we are actually really fortunate that we have a a heating and cooling plant, which is a community energy system that heats and cools City Hall and a number of other major downtown facilities. So as a municipality, I don't think we're going to be building a nuclear reactor anytime soon, but we are cognizant of our role in generating electricity and our role in promoting those technologies.
Anyone else on that? All right, so we do have a lot of hands up, and Danielle is moving about the room here, trying to get to a diverse range of people, so. She's even squeezing into the middle of the aisle. There we go.
My name is Summer Thomas. I'm from Fridays for Future Hamilton. Climate change is an inherently intersectional issue and cannot be solved without considering all demographics within the city of Hamilton as well as Canada globally, or Canada and the entire world. How will the city of Hamilton consider intersectionality as they move forward throughout this issue?
Thank you for your question. I totally agree that we can't actually tease out a climate lens without an equity lens. Those two things are inherently together. In fact, we can't talk about development in this city without intersecting and interconnecting social development, economic development, and environmental development. Those things are intrinsically linked. It was in the comments on the opening session that we can't tease them out. And so we can't have a conversation about increasing green space without having a conversation in a real way about who are the people and who is the population that's had to bear the brunt of decisions in the past that have prioritized profit, that have prioritized industry. So when we're looking, and I have to say as a Ward 3 City Councillor, looking at the industrial north end, when I have residents that come to me and say, you know, Councillor, I don't expect action. I know I live in the industrial north end. I just expect my health outcomes to be as they are. And the fact that we've got segments of our population who don't anticipate or expect elected leadership to come forward to say that what you have been historically experiencing for generations is wrong, and that your health outcomes matter just as much as anybody located anywhere else in this city. And if you don't have, and if we don't bring that compassion of humanity to those lived experiences and those human beings and say that your humanity is intrinsically as valuable as anybody else's, then we've got a problem. The problem is that we're not willing to look at the issue warts and all. And so what I'm really encouraged by is that our staff have actually recognized this from a landscape architect perspective and thinking about how do we design in a way that creates a green buffer to help try to restore the air quality, to help try to, land carbon. So, and looking at opportunities of land use, there's the new Stadium Precinct Community Park that some in the community would advocate needs to be an indoor multi-use sports facility, but our residents are desperate and saying, we need green infrastructure here. We don't know what trees look like at a full lifespan. We don't know what it's like to go for a walk around my corner and see green space, because that has not been there historically. So absolutely, and what's wonderful to hear as an incoming, as I guess a one-year councillor now, is that our staff have also been thinking about this. So I didn't take a lot of advocacy on my part when a land use opportunity came forward to say this should be green infrastructure. Staff were already ready to design with community input to meet that need. And I think that that's the way that we need to be thinking, is that the way that we've done things is not the way that we go forward. The way that we must go forward has to be in a way that absolutely says that equity is not ignorable and our climate crisis is not ignorable. So how do we open up and expand the solutions that are required where we can?
Just building on what Councillor Nann was saying, but I think outside of City of Hamilton kind of proper, I think as well there's been a lot of work that's been done inside of Hamilton and outside of Hamilton that we can learn a lot of on how to make the environmental movement more inclusive. And not to toot my own horn, because I haven't done anything about it really except for just being participation, but I think the work that Cindy's done chairing the board of directors for the City of Hamilton, for Environment Hamilton, and there are other board members for Environment Hamilton here. I think the work that Environment Hamilton has done has made me extremely proud in that we've denounced the yellow vest, neo-Nazis outside of City Hall, and we see the connection between how that movement got started and what it's now today, because that started off as a pro-oil protest, right? And so I think both within the City of Hamilton proper and outside of the City of Hamilton, I mean like the corporation, there's a lot that can be done to build a culture that intrinsically relates environmental justice to social and economic justice, and much like what Councillor Nann was saying, but I think everyone in this room can contribute to that culture, because without it happening everywhere, it's not going to happen at all.
Okay, going to our next question.
Good evening. I grew up in Ward 2. I'm a resident of Ward 1 now. And I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Saxe in the legal arena during the 90s. And when I was with the Ministry of the Environment, I had the occasion to meet a number of people in this audience back in the 90s. And I wish I had listened to them then. It was very frustrating that knowing what they were saying back then, Jason Farr, you said it, if you had listened to Linda and we got those pavements cleared now, if we start listening to these people, Ian, some of these other young people, if we start listening to them now, then we got to start acting on what they're saying. They're our academics. They know what's going on. We got to start listening to them. And I'm putting the question to you. I might be speaking to the ones that I shouldn't be speaking to here is, how long are we going to wait for all these things that you guys are telling us that you're going to do? We can't wait. We've heard that from Dr. Saxe. How long can we change the political process to speed up these things here in Hamilton?
Just for clarity, I think I said that and I'll try to answer your question. There's a lot we are already doing. I think that our friends in this room, many of them have helped us along that way, whether guided us with the idea from the inception or continue to partner with us now. But the motions, 3 over 7 years, yes, frustrating that it's taken this long to convert surface asphalt into greater and higher uses in the downtown core. I said probably started with a conversation 7 years ago with Environment Hamilton. Very frustrating that these things do take time. Probably if it was just one motion, it would have failed. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 to get the buy-in over time, and it takes a lot of smiling and laughing. So there's lots of stuff. There's 4 of us here. There's a city manager here that could probably spend the next hour talking about things. Just when Councillor Nann was talking about, the equity and the more challenged northern portions of her neighborhood. I grew up on the northern side in the same neighborhood and remember wiping the soot, so I know exactly the challenge, what the health challenges are. Every second day it was filthy. But historically there have been fighters. I know that our friends from Environment Hamilton will say the reason why Councillor Marula gets reelected with great percentages is because he fights. And one of the things he's been fighting for a long time is environmental issues in his Ward 4 next to Councillor Nann's. And taking on the big guys, the DeFascos and the big industries and the historically powerful big-time employers and philanthropists in many ways. Little things that we're doing, we can go on and on down the list, but the prevailing theme, I think, of where you're coming from is it's not soon enough now. We've recognized it's a crisis. We've moved a few motions since we've recognized it's a crisis, where in the whereases it says, whereas council unanimously feels there's a environmental crisis in the world right now, therefore move this motion. And I'm going to quote Councillor Terry Whitehead right now. Yeah, but to make things more expeditious, to make things move along, it is a money question. Dr. Saxe concluded with it will cost more. But Councillor Whitehead said years ago, it wasn't an environmental issue, but somebody tried to move a $10 million idea outside of the budget. It wasn't in the 10-year capital. It wasn't in the 10-year operating. It was just an idea, and it cost $10 million. And he yelled across the floor, I was probably my first year or second year as a councillor, what are you going to give up that we have budgeted that's worth $10 million? And I think as municipal elected officials, if we're going to be serious about all this, that's the way we need to think about things. You're hearing a lot in the news about 2 things these days, every day. The environment and the crisis that is, and locally, how we're in a budget crunch, how we're sitting at 5.5%. It's not going to be 5.5%, it's going to go way down. We always sit high and we go way down. But when we have before us all of these challenges, and we know, I mean, this room is full, but we know just from the federal election that this is the issue, and it's not going away. We need to think creatively with the funds that we have. And so if it means making sacrifices and taking that $10 million idea over here that we've just historically funded, that there's a group of people, small or large, in Hamilton that over many decades have expected it and said we need that 10 to tackle this crisis here. That's where municipally we got to work a lot harder and start focusing tomorrow. It was a great question.
I think the question was, when are you going to get on with it? Yeah. And what are we doing? And it all depends on you. Like there's some of the punditry that came out of the last federal election was that's the last federal election that any party will be able to run without a climate plan. So I've said this before, I have a 4-year plan. I have 3 years left in it, and I'm hoping that at the end of the 4th year, you and your neighbors are going to think, my vote matters. And you're going to canvass the people who come to your door and say, what's your number 1 issue? And do you believe that we're in a climate crisis? And what are you proposing to do about it? Because the greatest myth that's promoted out there is that your vote really doesn't matter. And if you're only getting 36% coming out, we're never going to get this across the line. So it means working collaboratively. It means trying to speak to those intersectional issues, to try and broaden actually the base of interest. It means speaking to people's self-interest. There's nothing wrong with that. I've often said, if I can't get you to love public transit, maybe you care about air emissions. Or maybe you care about the cost of maintaining our overbuilt highways that run through the heart of our city. Now, there's nothing wrong with me pivoting to your self-interest in trying to move the dial. But that's actually what it's going to take. It's going to take people who don't normally actually, who aren't normally engaged. And so it begins with everybody.
Thank you.
So what I heard today was that the people who came to council when the emergency declaration was before council, where you, because you were in the gallery, it got passed. When you guys show up, it matters. Go to council when there's a policy window and bring friends.
Our next question.
My name is Bill Medeiros, and I'm going to start what I heard from Councillor Wilson. We need to work collaborative. And I heard somebody mention that Mohawk College is doing something very important about environment. And I heard, and it's true, that last election environment was a top issue. I think we need the support from the federal government and other people who are working on this issue of addressing environment.
Do you have a question there? Okay. All right. Does anyone want to speak to that comment at all, or shall we just move on and we'll have one more question? Thank you for the comment.
So federal investment, absolutely. So council, just be leading up into the federal election, approved 5 priorities. And one of them was around the federal government needs to start working directly with cities and municipalities, because often we have to work through the province and money flows from the feds to the province, and sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't. So they, most people live in cities. They need to start working with us directly. And then the other is predictable, sustainable funding for transit, for climate change related, and housing. Grants that come and go do not allow us to plan how to effectively execute and put programs and plan transit routes, etc., when they kind of come and go. So that is our main federal priority. It is the same priority as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, so it's got a louder voice when all across the country cities are saying it. And we are, now that the government's been elected, we're going to continue to push those priorities.
Okay, thank you. And are we on to our last question then?
Thank you. I'm with Extinction Rebellion Hamilton, and we believe that the climate crisis is beyond politics, especially beyond partisan politics. So I'm curious as to whether you invited all of your colleagues from the council to come to this, or to be included, like to work with you on this evening, and whether they decided they didn't want to. And I'd like to know if any of them are actually here tonight. If any other councillors are here, could you please stand up? And so I'm wondering, is there a bit of a kind of partisan politics, even though you're technically people aren't in parties in municipal, but we all know they have leanings. Do you find it's an issue at all to get everybody on board, or do they think of it as sort of a left-wing issue still to be concerned and really want to get action on climate?
It's one of the most frustrating things is that when we have a dialogue in a political sphere about the climate or equity, that it becomes a left and right issue. That when people are demanding for action when it comes to climate, or when people are demanding for action when it speaks to how to foster real inclusion and a sense of belonging among each other as humans, that it gets couched into a left and right political debate. When the reality is that this is the issue. This issue, not just a climate justice issue, but a climate and equity justice issue, is the most pressing problem our humanity has to reconcile and act on. It is frustrating to all end that people will decide to put themselves in camps of left and right when looking at something that we need to be capable of facing together and coming to real solutions together with. I've got an equity lens to bring to a lot of things. My colleague here has an engineering lens to bring to it. Other folks have a financial lens to bring to it. Other folks have years of experience in governance to bring to the table. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation going forward. So to answer your question, invitation was there for all councillors to come tonight. As far as this initiative, it was a collaborative between 4 ward councillors. And part of the initiative came from, working with Environment Hamilton in terms of ward-specific dialogues that we each want to host in our wards moving forward, but also looking at how do we kick this conversation off. It's been a while since we declared that climate emergency. This conversation is an important dialogue that we need to continue having. And how do we inspire not only an exchange between our residents and your elected officials, but how do we also inspire a meaningful conversation around that council table with open minds ready to address this issue?
Thank you. So before we finish off this evening, we're just going to pose one more question to the panel, and anyone can start on this. Or actually, perhaps Councillor Farr, you can start on this. How can interested residents help all of us, or help you as the municipal council, move forward?
Well, I never have a problem getting engagement in Ward 2, and Councillor Nann's comments just now have me thinking about, when we first started talking about LRT years ago, there was a meeting held in the core, and then momentum started to build and interest started to build. This was in my time. There was lots of LRT talk before my time, too, more than 10 years ago. Then another meeting happened, and it was in the core. And suddenly, like every week, there seemed to be great meetings with even this many people and about LRT and talk about things we're doing for the environment. That started a long time ago, and it's happening. And it was in the core. And then Councillor Wilson actually started a group as soon as her kids were old enough to, I think, walk to school on their own. I can't remember what, the Useful Knowledge Society. And she came to the Durand Neighborhood Association to gear up interest and end up being very successful in gearing up interest with the Useful Knowledge Society. And I said one thing to my old friend, Councillor Wilson: if you're going to have your first meeting of the Useful Knowledge Society, have it in Ward 8. Because you wanted to talk about LRT, remember? So one of the things I'd suggest is get organized up there. I am telling you, there are there's a wide diversity of folks, young and old, and from every background, that will fill rooms at Mohawk College, that will fill rooms at Shadoke Rec Center, that will fill rooms in Glanbrook on this topic. They want to see a Dr. Saxe presentation, and they will be very involved in the Q&A and probably as passionate. And it might be, for some of them, their first ever community meeting in that capacity. I know how you feel down here, but I have a very, very strong, and I think there's probably everybody in this room that would feel the same way, a very, very strong feeling that people feel the same everywhere else, every corner of this city. And so we gotta spread the engagement throughout the city. I think most councillors would like to host something like that. If they don't, then figure out how to host it yourselves. You've done it before. But that's what I would say about that. It's really, really, truly important to keep going and keep growing.
On that subject, this started sort of with Environment Hamilton reaching out to Councillor Farr, asking if he would host a climate emergency town hall, and then it spiraled. But I think really what everyone can do to get more involved is join Environment Hamilton. We're a membership-based organization. We have monthly meetings that our board that has been putting on. We have regular events going on. We have free events all the time. But also you can donate to Environment Hamilton too. We have information just outside. And if you are from a ward that wasn't represented up here, please come and talk to me after this, because I want to work with your city councillor and you to get a town hall going in your ward.
When I think about community involvement and the climate crisis, it brings me back to that meeting, I'm not even sure when it was, in February, when we declared a climate emergency. And Dr. Saxe alluded to it, but the reason why we ended up declaring a climate emergency as a city, that wasn't on the agenda. That was a walk-on motion by Councillor Nann that Council unanimously passed because there were so many members of the public there in the gallery in support of us as a council taking real action. And that was kind of an epiphany for me as a new councillor to see the impact firsthand that residents of this city can have. And believe me, when you are sitting around that horseshoe and you look up in the gallery and you see that gallery full of citizens that are advocating for specific policy, it makes a difference on how council votes. So to my earlier point, we need you involved, we need your friends, and we need your friends' friends. And from a council perspective, I think, and also from a city perspective, is that we need to do perhaps a better job of communicating to you how you can get involved and what issues are on the agenda and what's coming up and what we need your help with.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That's been a great amount of ideas and things to think about and for us all to go back and plan with. And so I really appreciate everything we've heard tonight, and I'm really pleased to know that Council's thinking about climate change and public health as intersectionally connected, and there's win-wins here for everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for allowing me to participate in this way. It's been a great experience, and on behalf of the councillors and the staff, I'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight. So yes, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a great evening. Oh, and a special thanks to Dr. Saxe.
Thank you, Cindy, for moderating.